back to the Weather Center, everybody. It is February 7th, 2024. Yesterday's afternoon 12Z models looked very interesting, and let's just say overnight runs coming in at 0Z and our 6Z GFS look even more interesting, and we're going to delve into that here momentarily. But first, please like and share this content if you do enjoy what you see and enjoy the weather forecasts that I put out on this channel, and consider subscribing if you're new to the channel or have been kind of contemplating it back and forth and you've seen my videos popping up on your recommendations. It would mean a lot to me to gain a few more fellow members to the community here at the Weather Center. Not going to waste anyone's time today, guys. I have a lot to cover, and I want to delve into it all together, so let's get started. All right, before we delve into the model data and get into the sciencey aspect of it, and I tend to lose a lot of the viewers once we get into the meat and potatoes of what's going on, for those of you who do stick around, we'll definitely delve into those details, but I'm going to get the logistics out of the way initially. We have two very possible, very strong storm systems on the immediate horizon, one occurring near the Valentine's Day holiday, February 14th, and another that is expected to develop underneath that system, or just to the south of that source region between February 16th and the 18th. Both of these have been very back and forth in terms of what sort of impacts we're going to get, what sort of wintry impacts we're going to get, with our overnight models actually suggesting a return potentially, especially for our second system, of that widespread heavy snowfall and maybe even blizzard winter storm conditions. I'm also noticing a lot of back and forth, particularly with our GFS model, in terms of if that Arctic air mass is going to make a return, and as of 0 and 6 Zulu this morning, it does look like, at least for the upper tier United States, the Great Lakes and the Midwest, expanding into the Northeast, that Arctic air mass, that Arctic jet, is going to come back down. Now, naturally, especially with our continuity runs 6 and 18Z on the GFS, or any model for that matter, we definitely want to look a little bit closer at our hot model runs 0 and 12 with that fresh analysis data being plugged into the computer. So take that with a gigantic grain of salt, and with how much discontinuity and run-to-run inconsistency I've been seeing, particularly with that Arctic air mass and where that Arctic jet is going to position itself, we're going to see a lot of ebbing and flowing, guys. There's not going to be a whole lot of concrete evidence I can provide to you, at least in this video. As we get closer in time to the very tail end of February, which I do think is going to get very active for a lot of us, that's when we'll know a little bit more. All right, so this is where we stand currently. This is this morning at 7 a.m., February 7th. We have our winter storm system, that atmospheric river setup, trying to flush the pattern out. Try to imagine, if you harken back to a few videos ago, I'd mentioned that sharp amplitude blocking ridge acting like a traffic jam on our I-4 corridor for my Floridians out there for that upper air atmospheric pattern. In this case, this low pressure system is kind of acting like a highway patrolman and helping to clear up that congestion and get things moving back to their regular traffic flow again. So as I begin the loop, you can see that big old storm system moving through the northern tier United States, helping to bring some good wraparound snowfall for Montana, Wyoming, the front range of Colorado, maybe still continuing to see a dusting over the higher terrain mountain features in Utah, and particularly the Dakotas and Minnesota are going to see a lot of snowfall with this. That hasn't changed very much. We're pretty much locked in from that perspective. We also have this supporting 1024 high that's going to reintroduce a lot of good cold air to the northern plains, the central plains, trying to dip down towards the south, where you can get a very, very faint semblance of a frontal boundary draped across the Midwest through the central plains, Nebraska, Kansas, into the front range of Colorado, and down further to the south. As you see this setup begin to take shape, what we have going on is called an overrunning stationary frontal scenario. There is a little bit of cold advection or movement of that cold boundary. It's very weak, very minimal, because our parent low is now up over James Bay in Canada. So that wraparound flow and the push of high pressure with that cold air is really not going to be that substantial, which is why that warm advection occurring out of the Caribbean, out of the Yucatan Channel and the Gulf, is presenting us with that overrunning precip event from Texas all the way up into Tennessee, Kentucky, trying to get into the Midwestern states again as well. The models have been very finicky in terms of whether or not we're going to see any severe weather activity with our first low pressure system, and I should say we also are looking at very, very back and forth windshield wipering between all of our models in terms of our snow impacts. But the reason I do think severe weather should be a concern for a lot of us in the southeast and the mid-Atlantic is because of this optimal setup to produce synoptically driven convection, or I should say large-scale weather-induced, that large-scale trigger to trigger off those strong thunderstorms. systems. We have our frontal boundary right in through here that knows a high pressure slowly working its way through interior parts of CONUS, moving over the Appalachians, the Ohio, Mississippi Valley. And then we have a modifying polar high pressure that's still situated to the southwest of our Bermuda Island here, helping to draw in a lot of that warmer air and moisture from the equatorial regions to the south of where our polar high is trudging across the United States. And that's why you have all this stratiform showery precip occurring along the leading edge of that, because that warm air is interacting with that gentle slope, that gradual slope of cold air coming down and moving up to where it can condense and form that shower activity. So nothing crazy going on there. Not going to be any kind of snowfall or very heavy rainfall. It just could be very dreary conditions for an extended period of time. And then here we go, as a lot of folks like to mention, there goes our first bout of cyclogenesis over the south. This has been very consistent now. Today is Wednesday. We've been looking at this system trending on a lot of our model data since about late Saturday and into early Sunday morning this past weekend, and it does seem like the track and intensity is getting closer and closer to being locked in, with a potential strong system moving up towards the mid-Atlantic region in the northeast, dropping lots of snowfall. Now, I'm very cautious when I mention snowfall and intense or heavy snowfall for that matter as well, because our models have been very back and forth. The cold air does look to be in place. Here's our trademark 540 line nestled in on the backside, the leading edge of that snow band. That will help to induce some snowfall with lots of this wraparound moisture that's coming off of the warm front and helping to support our cold front for that matter. So it's going to be a wait-and-see game. The cold air is there, and if this system can deepen down far enough, we're already looking at a 981 millibar low at this point, moving up towards the northeast United States. That is going to help to funnel down a lot more of that bona fide polar air to freeze up that rainfall and transition it very quickly into snow, with a limited chance of seeing freezing rain because the warm layer just won't be there. It'll be predominantly off the coastline. We don't have a lot of cold air dammed up to the lee side of the Appalachians in this scenario. As I continue through time, you can see that high pressure very quickly comes into play. We have a good drying trend. We're going to have some very nice weather down here across the south and along the eastern seaboard. This next little weak clipper system, supported by our polar front jet, I do think is what the models are suggesting could help to prime, once again, that Arctic air mass, kind of tease it down to the south. Because if you notice, our 534, 540 line, and our 528 line, that clear delineation of where our polar front jet is likely situated at 300 millibars, runs right through the center of this low. And if you look just to the north of that over the southern Canadian provinces, there's our good old Arctic 510 line trying to come down south with a nice bubble of Arctic air right up in just to the east of James Bay in Quebec, trying to come down to the south. As we continue through time, take a look at what's happening down over the southwest portion of this chart off the Baja California Peninsula. It might look a little weird, hey, Weather Center Nazario, there's really nothing down there, looking at clear skies, maybe just some very, very faint green blips. What I'm looking at here, once again, is the thickness lines. If you look, we have some very substantial troughing going on across the western seaboard like so. And notice how just out ahead of it, where our difluent flow is at 300 millibars, we're getting a lot of precip action over Mexico, southern Texas. And then take a look, once again, we have another unstable wave supported by our polar front jet starting to take shape over the Dakotas, bringing down a 1036 high pressure that will likely have a little bit, just a little bit, guys, of that Arctic air kind of entrenched along its northern apex. And if you imagine the clockwise circulation around that high as it kind of draws in air from the north, there will be some modified Arctic air associated with it, but still not the main event that I'm looking at. We'll continue through the loop and fast forward. We'll kind of let this play out. There goes our next major unstable wave, bringing in that Arctic air. This is our 492 thickness line right in through here. And I'll show you guys later on down the road at 500 millibars why I do think that that is our Arctic jet, or the northern branch, the minus 31 degree isotherm at the 300 and 500 millibar level coming down. And then across the deep south, there's our very concerning cyclogenesis that has been trending on our models for about 48 to 60 hours now as well, looking very menacing. This could possibly be a major severe weather outbreak down here for our southeast coast, for our southeast United States, as well as a very potent winter storm for parts of Virginia, looking at North Carolina, West Virginia into Kentucky and Tennessee, as that system rapidly transitions off the coast, now supported not only by our subtropical and our polar front jet, but by our Arctic jet. At this point in the loop, we have our 492 thickness line, a nice bubble of bona fide Arctic air parked over eastern and central Ontario, trying to push into Quebec, with Arctic air for certain driving a lot of lake effect snow for our Great Lakes into the Midwest, particularly parts of Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, and just on the east side of Lake Erie and Lake Huron here, where Buffalo could definitely receive another good dusting of snowfall with this. Our 540 line is way down into Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi at this point. So again, we are now 288 hours into the future here, so lots of wiggle room, lots of lead time to really evaluate exactly what takes shape upstream outside of Western Canada, off the west coast of Florida, and off the west coast of the United States to see what's coming upstream. Here's a look at the GFS 300 millibar level so you can get an idea of exactly what's happening up there in the upper levels. So with that first system, the reason I keep saying it's very finicky is if you look, we have a very robust low-latitude jet. This is our El Nino jet that's been present for, it almost seems like forever at this point, with El Nino just kicking it in the eastern and central Pacific. But then notice how this finger of the polar front jet is actually fairly weak. We really don't have a lot of winds associated with it, which means we don't have very intense temperature discontinuity on the poleward side or on the equatorward or the north and south side of this jet axes. And as you take it further through time, it really doesn't do a whole lot. In fact, we lose a lot of the good polar front influence with it, and the jet becomes very diffuse across much of Western Canada, the Western United States, with it remaining fairly positively tilted the entire time before at the last second kind of getting ripped into the subtropical jet, merging with it and creating a nice shared energy region and good diffluence out over the mid-Atlantic and the northeast United States, and then transitions off the coast to no longer pose a significant threat or impact to anybody. Now, as I showed you on that mean sea level pressure chart, if you look off the southwest coast, look at this very intense troughing that's taking place with our El Nino jet. This is the subtropical jet, guys. And then notice how we have another good jet max coming in off the west coast. That's why I always mention we want to look upstream. If you follow a weather source that particularly hones in over the U.S. or over a smaller scale area in their forecast, tell them that's a big no-no. You got to look ahead. You got to look big picture. That's why we're looking at all of North and Central America here, with all the way up into Alaska, Greenland on this chart here, because I want to see big picture. What's happening out ahead of us that's coming towards us 1,000, 2,000 miles away. So as that jet max is introduced, we're going to see even more significant troughing occurring, with a nice cold sector beginning to establish itself over northern Mexico, the desert southwest, the Four Corners area of the U.S., over the central and southern Rockies. And look at this fire hose effect of very, very aggressive diffluent flow out ahead of this subtropical jet, with an introduction of not only polar front energy here, but this is definitely our Arctic branch trying to feed down into that as well, guys. So this could be very exciting as we get in towards the back end of February. We might see one last glimpse of a very intense winter season pattern really establish itself before we start headed into March and spring starts to really unveil itself to a lot of us, especially here in the South. Now, this is a new product I recently discovered. I'm going to take you guys through really quickly. This is our Euro Ensemble probabilities, and I know if you guys have been long-term followers of this channel, we used to love looking at the probabilities for tropical season. Well, it's really cool to see that the Euro now has published probabilities for our winter systems, or our baroclinic lows that could form over the United States. So as we take this through time, this is the probability of seeing a surface low of about 1,008 millibars, which is essentially a closed wave down at the low levels or at the surface of the environment beginning to take shape. And there's our first system really rapidly intensifying over the deep south, moving across towards the mid-Atlantic states with really good probabilities we will see something fairly decent and structured moving off the east coast, particularly over the mid-Atlantic, the northeast coastline of the U.S. And then as I continue further through time, there goes our next system. The Euro is definitely thinking we could see some kind of a system form up and make its way through Florida, very reminiscent of what we saw back in December, and even further there before that, back in October, where we had that little miniature tornado outbreak at the tail end of tropical season with that subtropical system that came out of the Bay of Campeche. Here's a quick glance of probabilities below 1,000 millibars, and I'll rapidly go through this. There's our first system. Probabilities are flagging it for sure that we could see some rapid cyclogenesis or intensification of it before it makes its way into the northeast and becomes an actual textbook nor'easter system. And then as I continue even further into the loop, by about 16th, 17th, and the 18th of February, we get a very faint whispering that something could be trying to form up in the Gulf of Mexico over the Gulf Coast states. Not a whole lot associated with it, just some gray, milky colors here indicating that 5 5 to 10 percentile that we could see something below 1,000 millibars form up. But it's not saying there's a low chance of a low pressure forming. See that little conundrum there, tongue twister. Low pressure, low forming. Anyways, that low pressure is likely to take shape. It just might not be the most organized until it gets out off into the western Atlantic and really picks up that jet support from the Arctic and the polar front jet coming down from the north. And while we're on the subject of what we used to use during the tropical season, we're actually going to look at our cyclone location European members here, because even though this is more or less used for tropical modeling, as you can see, we're across the North Atlantic here. You don't want to pay any attention to that. There's really nothing out there on the horizon. I'm mainly looking at the central Great Plains here in the southeast mid-Atlantic parts of the U.S., because this will show you a decent idea of what the Euro is thinking the chances are of seeing a low-pressure cyclone form, as we like to describe them, form up. So as we rapidly go through time, here comes our first system. Right there, we have decent ensemble agreement with it rapidly strengthening, moving into the mid-Atlantic and northeast U.S., and then as you continue in towards the back end of the loop, here comes our next round of ensemble members, pinging on a very slight possibility we could get something very similar to what we saw in October and December, moving in from the Gulf of Mexico and across the state of Florida, or scraping right up against the Gulf of Mexico coastline of Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama before ejecting out near to Georgia and the Carolinas. Now, this is where it gets fun. This is that science-y aspect I'd mentioned to you guys at the beginning of this video. I don't see any other sources using this, but this is our College of DuPage critical thickness chart, and this is excellent for kind of forecasting what type of precipitation you're going to get, whether it be rain, sleet, freezing rain, or snow. And I'm going to show you exactly why I do believe that not only is our first system going to be directly polar front driven, but why our next system could bring some of that Arctic impact down. So as you very quickly go through time, you can see that first system forms up right there. And just like clockwork, you can kind of put this in a textbook if you wanted to. Look at how all of our critical thickness values feed right into the center of that low. Perfect. Perfect cyclogenesis, perfect baroclinic model right here. Here's your cold sector, and then there's your warm sector forming up in this type B baroclinic leaf here. Very wonderful that you could see that, a good visual representation of it. I'll clear the ink and continue down the road. And then here we go. You can see that trough axis really digging in over the west. And then notice how we get this nice pocket of dry air. This is called channel darkening. This could very well be our Arctic jet trying to come down to the south, supporting an Arctic-driven low-pressure system over Canada. And then here comes our next storm system getting formed up by our subtropical jet and our polar front trying to get pulled down to the south. So this is why I do believe this next system, if it does hold together and does trend, could be very interesting. Just like that severe outbreak at the beginning of January, we could have 3 jet fingers actually supporting this system and creating all sorts of chaos with it. If you go a little further through time, you can see all 3 of them kind of converge over the eastern coast. I'll kind of go back and forth so you can see polar front jet right in the center with those critical thickness lines, that subtropical system coming out of the Gulf, coming out of Mexico, southern Texas, and then if you follow that channel darkening over the Canadian border into the U.S., the upper Midwest area, all 3 of them converge right there. I'll try not to move the slider and I'll draw it for you guys. Here's our Arctic branch coming down. This is our polar front branch right in through here, and then obviously we still have that low latitude El Nino jet cycling through. I'll clear the ink so it becomes a little bit less of a conglomerative mess. There's 1, there's 2, and then here we go, we have 3. So this could be a pretty gnarly setup if, guys, the big disclaimer, the elephant in the room, if this holds together. Lots of widespread winter and severe weather impacts could be unfolding from the Great Lakes all the way through to the Gulf coastline and the Central Florida Peninsula. And then last but not least, before we close out the video, guys, I'm going to show you a little bit more of an educational piece. I don't see a lot of folks mentioning this as well, but if you think about it in terms of what cold and warm air does, cold air is naturally going to be a lot more shallow. It's more dense, so it sits closer in the atmosphere, closer to ground level, lower in the atmosphere. Warm air naturally is going to rise. It's going to be more expansive, less dense, so it'll sit higher in the atmosphere. So if you're ever trying to evaluate whether or not you have an Arctic branch of your jet coming down, or if you have Arctic air preparing to invade, you actually want to look at 500 millibars and not necessarily 300 or 200. 300 be more PFJ, 200 be more STJ or subtropical jet. 500 is where you'll find that very shallow, dense pool of Arctic air. And watch this. So before we get started, here's our El Nino jet over the south. Here looks to be some remnants of our polar front jet trying to do its thing over interior CONUS, with a little bit more of that breakaway diffluent flow kind of occurring over the U.S.-Canadian border, moving through the Great Lakes, the Midwest. As you take this through time, notice what we have going on over northern Canada. You see this finger of the jet right in through here? This here, folks, would be your Arctic jet at 500 millibars. There is your Arctic jet moving across the northern tier. And if you guys remember at this point in time, this is February 13th. If you go way back to the beginning of this video, I'd showed you that our critical thickness lines for delineating or identifying that Arctic air were beginning to set up over eastern Canada and trying to push down towards the northeast. And this lines up extremely well with that. Now, I want y'all to keep a very close eye on what happens right here with this Jetmax. And now, believe it or not, this is to the north of Alaska. So if you want to argue whether or not this is Arctic jet or not, just remember, you're looking at something north of Alaska. And this is also exactly why we don't want to fixate on a very small grid box. We want to look at the big picture to really identify what's happening in the weather pattern. So follow that Jetmax through, and as that next system begins to intensify, there's our trough down off the west coast of Mexico, Baja California. Notice as we get through the pattern and we start to see this setup really ramp up, I'm going to clear the ink and highlight it for you guys. Once again, look at how this jet finger is now marching its way south through Manitoba, Alberta, heading through Ontario at this point. Notice how our subtropical jet is here, and we have a very weak finger of the polar front jet moving through here, guys. This is that convergent flow I was mentioning in the upper levels, and then there you go. There goes our Arctic jet really screaming on down to the south. This could be another East Coast, Eastern U.S. Arctic invasion here, where you can see our Arctic jet really does trough down way to the south. And just look at the abundance of shared energy right here. This is kind of what I was alluding to on that critical thickness chart. If you notice, we have all three of our jets merging and creating a pretty sporty, is how I'll describe it, shared energy region for the mid-Atlantic, the Northeast, and this will most definitely ramp up our potential for severe thunderstorms through the Carolinas, through Virginia, maybe not necessarily Virginia. I take that back. We'll definitely be in the cold sector of this phenomena, but along the Gulf coastline, especially if that low-pressure system does shake out and develop with the support of our subtropical and eventually the polar front jet, and with a little bit of that interaction, that peppering of our Arctic branch trying to get pulled into all this mess, that'll definitely open up the gates of winter you-know-what. Alrighty, folks, there you have it. We're going to go ahead and close out the video. Thank you very much for taking some time out of today to join me for this Weather Center segment, and I do hope you've been enjoying the new rollout procedures of this content. We will continue to update you guys, and if you weren't available for the live stream yesterday, I had mentioned that the new battle rhythm for the channel is Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. We will likely have these harder segments, these things for the channel that you guys can come back to on a regular basis. And then Tuesdays and Thursdays, particularly, we will be doing our 8 p.m. Weather Center live segments with, of course, pending what the weather conditions look like. We may need to do more than that, or we may need to do less than that, just because if there's nothing happening, no reason to keep talking about things or hyping things up. And if there is more going on, naturally, we're going to break in for some live coverage of it. So as I mentioned previously, please like and share this content if you enjoy these Weather Center updates, and consider subscribing if you're new to the channel or have been back and forth as to whether or not you want to. We don't promote sensationalism. We don't promote scare tactics. We stick to the science. We stick to the accuracy as best as I can possibly do for you guys as an up-and-coming meteorologist. So thank you guys for watching. We'll see you again very soon. And until next time, this is Weather Center Nazario, signing out.